The millionaire's daughter complained all day, until the new nanny removed something strange from her head. Castleford Mansion, perched atop the Belgravia district in Birmingham, was the epitome of architectural perfection and silence disguised as peace. Behind automatic gates, cameras, and perfectly manicured gardens lived Robert, a well-known tech entrepreneur, widowed since the tragic passing of his wife Claire just over a year ago. Since then, he had lived with his daughter Mariah, only 8 years old, and his mother, Mrs. Eleanor, a rigid woman, devoted to appearances and control. In that environment of untouchable luxury, no one dared to question what transpired behind the thick curtains and courteous discipline. Victoria Davies was 27 years old when she first passed through those gates. She carried a small suitcase, a resume printed on plain paper, and an urgent need for a fresh start. Unemployed for almost 6 months, she had lost her rented apartment in the Soho area and desperately needed an opportunity. When she saw the advertisement for a nanny in a family home in Belgravia, she didn't hesitate. She sent her resume immediately. The response came the next day. The interview was scheduled for a rainy Monday morning, typical of April in Birmingham. Upon arrival, Victoria was greeted by a maid in an impeccable uniform, who led her through wide corridors decorated with modern paintings and European designer furniture. Everything there exuded money, but also a coldness she couldn't quite name. She was led to a living room where Mrs. Eleanor awaited her, seated in a beige leather armchair, hands crossed on her lap, and a gaze that seemed to assess every detail. Mrs. Eleanor was a woman in her 60s, with grey hair pulled back in a low bun, dressed in sober and elegant clothes. Her face was marked by fine wrinkles, but her eyes were hard, vigilant. She greeted Victoria with a nod and indicated the chair in front of her. The conversation was direct, almost perfunctory. Mrs. Eleanor explained that the family needed someone responsible, discreet, and, above all, obedient. Mariah, she said, was an emotionally unstable child since the loss of her mother. She suffered from mood swings, extreme sensitivity, and temper tantrums. She was, in her grandmother's words, a difficult girl. Victoria listened carefully, but answered no more than necessary. She was there out of necessity. She accepted the job immediately. Mrs. Eleanor seemed satisfied with the candidate's submissive demeanor. She explained the hours, the house rules, the security, protocols. Everything had a place, a time, a correct way of being done. Victoria nodded at each instruction, mentally storing every detail. At the end of the conversation, she was informed that she would start the next day. When Victoria returned to the mansion the next morning, she was introduced to the other staff. There was the cook, Mrs. Lucy, a middle-aged woman, friendly but reserved. The chauffeur, Mr. Anthony, a man of few words who avoided eye contact, and the housemaid, Jessica, a young woman in her 20s who always seemed rushed as if she wanted to finish her work quickly and leave. Everyone was cordial but distant. Victoria realized that there was no room for intimacy there. Mariah appeared only in the late afternoon. She was a thin girl with pale skin, large dark eyes that seemed to carry an invisible weight. She wore a light pink dress, white socks, and patent leather shoes. But what most caught Victoria's attention was the pink scarf that completely covered the child's head, tied carefully at the nape of her neck. Mariah did not smile when introduced. She merely looked at Victoria with an empty, almost frightened expression and mumbled a low greeting before retreating to her room. In the first few days, Victoria observed more than she spoke. Mariah was a reclusive child who walked with her head down, rarely ate properly, slept little, and never removed the pink scarf from her head. She complained of aches, cold noises, and especially cried at night, always muffled, contained, as if she had no right to be heard. When Victoria tried to approach her gently, she noticed that the girl recoiled, like someone shrinking back in anticipation of punishment. She found the fear strange, but still didn't understand its origin. The house routine was rigorous. Mariah woke at 7 in the morning, bathed alone, dressed in clothes chosen by Mrs. Eleanor, and went down for breakfast. She ate little, always under the watchful eye of her grandmother, who corrected her posture, her way of holding cutlery, the tone of her voice. Afterwards, she went to the private school in the Mayfair district, accompanied by the chauffeur. She returned in the early afternoon, ate lunch in silence, and went up to her room, where she stayed until dinner time. Victoria was responsible for accompanying her with schoolwork, bathing, and bedtime. But the girl barely spoke. She answered only what was necessary, always with fear in her eyes. Victoria tried several times to start a conversation. She asked about school, about friends, about what she liked to do. Mariah answered in monosyllables. She had no friends. She liked nothing. She just obeyed. One afternoon, Victoria brought a children's storybook and tried to read to the girl. Mariah listened in silence, but when Victoria asked if she had enjoyed it, the child merely shrugged and asked to go to the bathroom. Victoria felt a tightening in her chest. Something was deeply wrong in that house. The house seemed to move around a silent tension. The other staff avoided the second floor. Victoria was instructed not to enter the girl's room without authorization. One night, after hearing Mariah sobbing alone in the bathroom, Victoria slowly went upstairs. When she reached the door, she noticed that the crying stopped abruptly. The girl took a long time to come out, and, when she did, her red eyes revealed more than any words. Victoria noticed a small dark spot trickling down the back of the girl's neck, and on impulse tried to get a better look, but Mariah quickly adjusted her scarf and ran off. In the following days, strange situations began to repeat themselves. Notes appeared in the most improbable places, always with subtle but threatening phrases. One of them, left on her bag, read, "Don't try to be a hero. Here, heroes fall." Victoria felt a shiver run down her spine. Who was leaving those messages, and why? She kept the note and decided to stay alert. Another note appeared days later, this time inside her closet. "Mind your own business. Mariah is not your responsibility." Victoria began to feel fear, but also a growing indignation. Someone was trying to intimidate her, and this only confirmed her suspicions that something very wrong was happening. What most disturbed Victoria was how everyone seemed to accept the girl's suffering as normal. A pantry worker even commented that Mariah did it for attention. Other employees treated her with distance, as if the child were a problem to be avoided. Mrs. Eleanor, in turn, maintained absolute control over everything. She decided what Mariah ate, wore, did. She even controlled the conversations her granddaughter had with others. And Robert, the father, was an almost absent figure. He spent most of his time in the office, traveling, or locked in his home office. When he was home, he barely looked at his daughter. He seemed to live in a world apart, oblivious to the child's suffering. Victoria, however, felt that something deeper and very wrong was happening. She began to pay attention to details that had previously gone unnoticed. Mariah avoided touching anything with unprotected hands. She always wore gloves or asked for help. She complained of frequent headaches, but never allowed anyone to touch her scarf. When Victoria suggested that the girl see a doctor, Mrs. Eleanor was categorical. Mariah was already being monitored by specialists. There was no need for concern. But Victoria didn't believe it. Something didn't fit. One morning, while collecting dirty clothes from Mariah's bathroom, Victoria found strands of hair caked with dried blood hidden in the basket. Her heart pounded. She carefully picked up the strands, wrapped them in paper, and put them in her pocket. That was no longer just discomfort. It was a sign of aggression. The next day, after another muffled cry, Victoria decided to confront the girl. She waited until they were alone in the room after dinner. She sat next to Mariah, on the bed, and in a soft voice, asked if everything was all right. The girl didn't answer. She just looked at the floor, trembling. Victoria insisted. She said she was there to help, that Mariah could trust her. The child began to cry, but still didn't speak. Victoria then very carefully reached out towards the scarf. Mariah recoiled, startled, but Victoria gently held her hand and said she needed to see, that she wouldn't hurt her, that she just wanted to understand. Mariah hesitated, but something in Victoria's voice made her give in. With tears streaming down her face, the girl allowed the nanny to remove the scarf. What Victoria found was impossible to forget. The child's scalp was marked by dozens of small perforations, some infected, others still bleeding. Paper clips, like those used in an office, were embedded directly in her skin, some rusty, others still fresh. The scene was brutal. Victoria felt her stomach churn. Her hands trembled. She looked at Mariah, who was crying in silence, and felt a deep, visceral rage. Who would do that to a child? Who was capable of such cruelty? Mariah, between sobs, begged Victoria not to tell anyone. She said that if anyone found out it would be worse, that she would be punished again. Victoria tried to calm her, promised to protect her, but the girl just shook her head, desperate. She said no one could know, that it was a secret. Victoria felt helpless. How could she protect a child who was so afraid of being protected? That night, Victoria could barely sleep. She kept thinking about what to do. She needed to report it. But to whom? Mrs. Eleanor controlled everything. Robert seemed oblivious, and Mariah was too terrified to speak. Victoria knew she needed proof, something concrete she could use to get the girl out of that hell. She decided she would document everything, take photos, keep the strands of hair, note every detail. But she needed to act carefully. Any false step could put Mariah in even greater danger. The next day, Victoria tried to approach Robert. She waited until he was alone in his office and knocked on the door. He received her with a tired but polite look. Victoria said she needed to talk about Mariah, that she was concerned about the girl's health. Robert sighed and said he knew his daughter was difficult, that he was doing his best to help her. Victoria tried to insist, but he interrupted her. He said he trusted his mother to take care of Mariah, that Mrs. Eleanor knew what was best for her granddaughter. He thanked Victoria for her concern, but made it clear that the matter was closed. Victoria left the office frustrated. Robert wouldn't help. He was blind, or worse, indifferent. She needed to find another way to protect Mariah. She thought about contacting the school, but feared Mrs. Eleanor would find out and fire her before she could do anything. She thought about going to the police, but without concrete evidence, who would believe her? It was the word of a newly hired nanny against that of a wealthy and respected family. Meanwhile, Mariah continued to suffer in silence. Victoria noticed that the girl was increasingly weak, paler. She ate even less, slept even worse. There were nights when Victoria heard her cry until dawn, and always, always the pink scarf covering the wounds that no one but Victoria knew existed. One afternoon, Victoria was in Mariah's room helping her with homework when she heard footsteps in the corridor. It was Mrs. Eleanor. She entered without knocking, with that cold, calculating look. She asked what they were doing. Victoria replied that they were finishing math homework. Mrs. Eleanor nodded but did not leave. She stayed there, observing as if evaluating every movement. Victoria felt a chill. There was something deeply disturbing about the way that woman looked at her own granddaughter. When Mrs. Eleanor finally left, Mariah let out a sigh of relief. Victoria noticed that the girl was trembling. She asked if everything was all right, but Mariah merely shook her head and went back to her homework. Victoria knew she had to act soon. Every day that passed, Mariah was in greater danger. That night, Victoria decided she would take photos of the wounds. She waited until everyone was asleep and went up to Mariah's room. The girl was awake, staring at the ceiling. Victoria explained what she wanted to do. Mariah hesitated but eventually agreed. Victoria carefully removed the scarf and took several photos with her phone. The images were shocking. They clearly showed the clips embedded in the skin, the infected wounds, the child's suffering. Victoria put her phone away and promised Mariah that she would do everything in her power to get her out of there. But before she could do anything, everything fell apart. The next day, upon waking, Victoria realized that her phone had disappeared. She searched everywhere, but couldn't find it. She felt a chill down her spine. Someone had entered her room during the night and taken her phone, and she knew exactly who it was. Mrs. Eleanor called her for a conversation in the living room. She was accompanied by Robert, who looked confused and worried. Mrs. Eleanor, with a chilling calm, accused Victoria of having assaulted Mariah. She said she had found clips in the nanny's apron, that there was blood on the sheets in Victoria's room, that there were witnesses who saw her entering the girls' room during the night. Victoria tried to defend herself, but Mrs. Eleanor had already planted all the evidence. Robert looked at Victoria with a mixture of disappointment and anger. He said he trusted her, that he had opened the doors of his house, and that she had betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. Victoria tried to explain, tried to tell the truth, but no one listened. Mrs. Eleanor had already called the police. Within minutes, Victoria was handcuffed and taken away. As she was dragged out of the mansion, she looked back and saw Mariah at the second-floor window, crying in silence, with the pink scarf covering the wounds that no one but Victoria knew existed. And at that moment, Victoria understood that she had fallen into a carefully planned trap. Mrs. Eleanor had anticipated every move, had manipulated every detail. And now Victoria was the culprit, the villain, the aggressor. As the police car drove away from the mansion, Victoria felt a mixture of despair and helplessness. She knew her life was ruined. She knew no one would believe her, but she also knew that Mariah was still there, suffering, and that now there was no one left to protect her. Tears streamed down her face as the car descended the Belgravia slope, leaving behind the Castleford mansion, where silence disguised as peace hid a horror few could imagine. The repercussions were immediate. Within hours, the story was on news websites. Nanny tortures millionaire's daughter with clips on her scalp. Victoria's image, handcuffed, circulated on social media, accompanied by angry comments. She lost her job, her home, was evicted and repudiated even by old friends. She tried to defend herself, but without evidence or witnesses, only the silence of humiliation remained. She slept on the street. She went hungry. She was threatened. And still, she thought of Mariah. Meanwhile, at the Castleford mansion, life continued as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Eleanor maintained absolute control. Mariah continued to suffer in silence, and Robert, blinded by his mother's manipulation, believed he had done the right thing by protecting his daughter from the dangerous nanny. But the truth, as always, was hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to come to light. And that moment was closer than anyone could imagine. The Fitzrovia police station in Birmingham was a cold, impersonal place where the smell of stale coffee mingled with cheap disinfectant. Victoria Davies sat on a hard plastic chair, handcuffed, her face swollen from crying. Around her, police officers came and went, filling out papers, answering phones, completely ignoring the despair etched in her eyes. She tried to explain, tried to tell the truth, but no one wanted to listen. Mrs. Eleanor's version was solid, well-constructed, supported by planted evidence and the credibility of a wealthy and respected family. Victoria was just an unemployed nanny, without references, without defense. The detective who interrogated her was direct and impatient. He asked why she had done it, why she had hurt a defenseless child. Victoria tried to explain that she hadn't done anything, that it was all a lie, that someone else was hurting Mariah. But the detective just shook his head, tired. He said there was evidence, there were witnesses, that she would be indicted for child abuse and assault. Victoria felt the ground collapse beneath her feet. Her life was over. She spent the night in the cell, sharing the space, with other women who looked at her with contempt. One of them spat on the floor upon learning what Victoria was accused of. She said that anyone who hurts a child doesn't deserve to live. Victoria huddled in the corner, hugging her knees, trying to protect herself from the hatred that surrounded her. She couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Mariah, alone in that mansion, suffering at the hands of Mrs. Eleanor, with no one to protect her. She felt guilty for having failed, for not having been more careful, for having underestimated the coldness of that woman. The next morning she was taken for her custody hearing. The judge, a middle-aged man with a tired expression, quickly listened to the prosecution's account and decided on pre-trial detention. Victoria tried to speak, but the public defender representing her asked her to remain silent. He said that anything she said could worsen her situation. Victoria felt helpless. She was being condemned without a chance to defend herself. But before she was taken back to her cell, something unexpected happened. A young lawyer with black hair tied in a ponytail entered the room and asked to speak with the judge. She said she represented Victoria Davies and would like to request the defendant's provisional release. The judge frowned, surprised. The public defender also looked confused. Victoria looked at the woman without understanding. She didn't know her. She had never seen her before. The lawyer introduced herself as Dr. Camilla Foster, a specialist in child and adolescent rights. She said she had followed the case in the press and had reasons to believe that Victoria was innocent. She presented a formal request for provisional release, arguing that there was no concrete evidence against the defendant, only circumstantial indications. The prosecutor protested. But the judge, intrigued, decided to grant provisional release upon payment of bail. Camilla paid the bail with her own money, and within hours, Victoria was free. Upon leaving the police station, Victoria looked at Camilla with tears in her eyes. She asked why she had done that, why she had helped a stranger. Camilla smiled sadly and said she believed her, that there was something about that story that didn't fit, that she wanted to hear Victoria's version before drawing any conclusions. She took Victoria to a nearby cafe and for hours listened attentively to everything she had to say. Victoria told her about Mariah's wounds, about the clips embedded in her scalp, about the girl's fear, about the threatening notes, about Mrs. Eleanor's coldness. Camilla wrote down every detail, asked specific questions, requested precise descriptions. When Victoria finished, Camilla remained silent for a few moments, pensive. Then she said she believed her, that she would do everything in her power to prove her innocence and, more importantly, to protect Mariah. But reality was cruel. Even free, Victoria was marked. Her photo had circulated on social media, accompanied by hateful comments. She was recognized on the street and insulted. She lost the apartment where she lived, as the landlord did not want to renew the contract. She couldn't find a job, as no one wanted to hire someone accused of assaulting a child. She started sleeping at Camilla's house, who temporarily took her in. But she knew she couldn't stay there forever. She needed to clear her name. She needed to save Mariah. Meanwhile, at the Castleford mansion, life continued its seemingly normal course. Mariah returned to school, accompanied by the chauffeur. Mrs. Eleanor maintained absolute control over her granddaughter's routine. Robert remained immersed in work, oblivious to his daughter's suffering. But something had changed. Mariah was even more withdrawn, even more silent. She didn't talk to anyone at school. She didn't play. She didn't smile. She just obeyed. Mariah's teacher, Julia Miller, began to notice that something was wrong. The girl was increasingly pale, weaker. She complained of constant headaches. Once, during physical education class, Mariah fainted. She was rushed to the school infirmary. The nurse, examining the girl, noticed that she had a fever and that the pink scarf covering her head was stained with blood. She tried to remove the scarf, but Mariah panicked, screaming and crying, begging them not to touch her. The school principal was called. She tried to calm Mariah, but the girl was in a state of shock. They called Mrs. Eleanor, who arrived quickly, with that air of controlled concern. She said that Mariah had emotional problems since the loss of her mother, that she was undergoing psychological treatment, that this was normal. The principal, though suspicious, did not insist. Mrs. Eleanor took Mariah back home, but the school nurse, a woman named Beatrice, was not convinced. There was something deeply disturbing about Mariah's reaction. She decided to make a detailed report of the incident and send it to Child Protective Services. She described the girl's condition, the fever, the blood on the scarf, the panic when trying to remove it. She asked them to investigate the situation. The report was received and filed. No one took any action. Camilla, meanwhile, was investigating on her own. She spoke with former employees of the Castleford mansion, trying to find someone who could confirm Victoria's version. Most refused to speak, fearing reprisals. But a former maid, a woman named Sonia, who had worked in the house years ago, agreed to talk. She said that Mrs. Eleanor had always been a controlling woman, obsessive about perfection, that she treated employees with coldness and contempt, that there were rumors that she also treated her daughter-in-law, Claire, with cruelty. But nothing concrete, nothing that could be used as evidence. Camilla also tried to speak with Robert, but he refused to receive her. He sent a message through his lawyer saying that he had nothing to declare, that he trusted justice, and that he hoped the nanny who had hurt his daughter would be punished with the full rigor of the law. Camilla realized that Robert was completely manipulated by Mrs. Eleanor. He firmly believed his mother's version, and that made everything even more difficult. Victoria, for her part, was increasingly desperate. She knew Mariah was still suffering, but there was nothing she could do. She tried to return to the mansion but was stopped by the security guards. She tried to talk to Robert, but he didn't answer her calls. She tried to report Mrs. Eleanor to Child Protective Services, but without evidence her word was worthless. She was trapped in a cycle of helplessness and despair. One night Victoria had an idea. She remembered that she had taken photos of Mariah's wounds before her phone was stolen, but the photos were in the cloud. If she could access her account, she could recover them. She asked Camilla for help, who got a computer and helped Victoria log in. And there were the photos. Shocking, brutal, irrefutable. They clearly showed the clips embedded in Mariah's scalp, the infected wounds, the child's suffering. Camilla remained silent as she saw the images. Then she looked at Victoria and said that this was the proof they needed, that she would use those photos to reopen the case to report Mrs. Eleanor to get Mariah out of that house. Victoria felt hope rekindle. Finally, they had a chance to save the girl, but before they could do anything, they received devastating news. Mariah had been rushed to St. Thomas's Hospital in Lambeth. She had severe anemia, malnutrition, and signs of a generalized infection. Her condition was critical. Victoria and Camilla rushed to the hospital, but were prevented from entering. Only family members were allowed to visit the girl. Victoria felt helpless once again. Mariah was there, so close, but she could do nothing to help her. Camilla, however, did not give up. She used her contacts to speak with one of the nurses who was caring for Mariah. The nurse, a woman named Fiona, said that the girl's condition was worrying, that there were clear signs of abuse, that the wounds on her scalp were recent and did not match the timeline of Victoria's arrest, that there was something very wrong with that story. Camilla asked Fiona to document everything, to take photos, to make a detailed report. Fiona hesitated but eventually agreed. She said she couldn't stand idly by watching a child suffer. Meanwhile, Mrs. Eleanor was at the hospital, maintaining absolute control over the situation. She did not allow anyone to approach Mariah without her authorization. She spoke with the doctors privately, explaining that her granddaughter had emotional problems, that she self-mutilated, that she was undergoing psychiatric treatment. The doctors, though suspicious, had no way to prove otherwise. Mrs. Eleanor was convincing, controlled, persuasive, and she had Robert's support, who believed every word his mother said. But Mariah, even weak and debilitated, was starting to react. One night, when Mrs. Eleanor left the room to speak with the doctors, Mariah asked Nurse Fiona for a notebook and a pen. With trembling hands, she wrote, "I need help, but I can't tell." Fiona read the message and felt a chill. She asked the girl who was hurting her, but Mariah just shook her head, fear in her eyes. Fiona kept the notebook and decided she would do something. She didn't know exactly what, but she couldn't stand still. The next day, Fiona sought out Camilla and showed her Mariah's message. Camilla felt a mixture of relief and urgency. Finally, they had something concrete, but they needed to act fast. Mariah was in danger and Mrs. Eleanor was getting closer to covering everything up. Camilla decided to go to court. She prepared a detailed petition, attaching the photos of Mariah's wounds, Nurse Beatrice's report, Fiona's testimony, and the message written by the girl herself. She requested the opening of a formal investigation against Mrs. Eleanor and the immediate removal of Mariah from her grandmother's custody. She filed the petition and waited. She knew it could take days, weeks, but it was the only chance they had. Meanwhile, Victoria was trying to rebuild her life. She got a temporary job at a snack bar in downtown Birmingham. The salary was low, but it was better than nothing. She worked from morning to night, trying to save money to rent a room. But with each passing day, she thought of Mariah. She wondered if the girl was okay, if she was suffering, if she still had hope. And she promised herself that she wouldn't give up, that she would fight to the end to clear her name and to save the child no one else seemed to care about. One afternoon, while serving coffee at a table, Victoria overheard a conversation between two customers. They were talking about the case of the nanny who had tortured the businessman's daughter. One of them said the nanny deserved to rot in jail. The other agreed. Victoria felt tears burn her eyes. but swallowed the cry and continued working. She knew public opinion was against her. She knew many people hated her without even knowing her side of the story. But she also knew that the truth sooner or later would come out. And when it did, everyone would see who the real villain of that story was. Meanwhile, at the Castleford mansion, Mrs. Eleanor was increasingly nervous. She knew things were starting to get out of control. The hospital nurse was asking too many questions. Victoria's lawyer was investigating. And Mariah, even weak, was starting to show signs that she could speak. Mrs. Eleanor knew she had to act fast. She needed to ensure Mariah remained silent. She needed to maintain control. One night when she visited Mariah in the hospital, Mrs. Eleanor sat next to her granddaughter and, in a soft but threatening voice, said that if she told anyone anything, things would get much worse. That she would lose her father, lose her home, lose everything. That no one would believe her. That everyone would think she was crazy, just like they thought of her mother. Mariah, with tears streaming down her face, just nodded. She knew she had no choice. She knew she was trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't escape. But what Mrs. Eleanor didn't know was that Fiona was outside the room, listening to everything. She had been suspicious of the grandmother's demeanor and decided to keep an eye on her. When she heard the threat, she felt a deep anger. That woman was a monster, and she wouldn't allow her to continue hurting that child. She decided she would record everything, that she would get concrete evidence, that she would do whatever it took to protect Mariah. The next day, Fiona sought out Camilla again and told her what she had heard. Camilla felt a mixture of indignation and hope. Finally, they were getting close to the truth. She asked Fiona to continue documenting everything, to record any suspicious conversation, not to leave Mrs. Eleanor alone with Mariah. Fiona agreed. She knew she was risking her job, but she didn't care. There were more important things than a job. Meanwhile, Camilla's petition was being reviewed by a judge. He carefully read all the documents, saw the photos, read the reports. He was shocked by what he saw. He decided to open a formal investigation. He ordered a social worker to visit the Castleford mansion and make a detailed report on Mariah's living conditions. He also determined that the girl should be examined by a forensic doctor to assess the extent of the injuries and determine if they were compatible with the prosecution's version. When Mrs. Eleanor was informed of the judge's decision, she felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. She knew she was losing control. She knew the truth was about to come out, and she knew that when it did, her life would be ruined, but she wouldn't give up, not without a fight. She began to prepare a new strategy. She began to manipulate Robert even more, convincing him that all of this was a persecution, an attempt to destroy the family. Robert, blinded by his mother's manipulation, believed her, and he decided he would do everything in his power to protect his mother and daughter. But the truth, as always, was stronger than any manipulation, and it was about to explode in a way no one could predict. Mariah, even weak and frightened, was beginning to find the strength to speak, and when that happened, nothing would ever be the same. The Castleford mansion, with its automatic gates and perfectly manicured gardens, was about to have its darkest secrets revealed, and Victoria, the unjustly accused nanny, was about to have her redemption, but the path there would still be long, painful, and full of twists and turns that no one could imagine. The social worker assigned to the case was a woman named Helen Carter, experienced with a keen eye and firm demeanor. She had worked for over 15 years at Child Protective Services in Birmingham and had seen it all. But when she read Mariah Castleford's case file, she felt a shiver. The photos of the wounds were shocking, the reports were disturbing, and the coldness with which everything had been covered up was frightening. Helen knew she was dealing with a serious case and that she needed to act with care and precision. On a rainy Wednesday morning, Helen arrived at the Castleford mansion. She was greeted by Mrs. Eleanor, who offered a polite but cold smile. The house was impeccable, as always. Everything in its place, everything clean, everything perfectly organized. Mrs. Eleanor led Helen to the living room and offered coffee. Helen accepted, but remained attentive to every detail. She observed the way Mrs. Eleanor moved, the way she spoke, the way she controlled every aspect of the conversation. Mrs. Eleanor explained in a calm and controlled voice that Mariah was a difficult child, that she had lost her mother traumatically, and that since then she had exhibited self-destructive behaviors, that she was undergoing psychological and psychiatric treatment, that the family was doing everything they could to help her. Helen listened in silence, noting every word. Then she asked to see Mariah. Mrs. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed. She said the girl was still recovering from her hospitalization, that she was fragile, that perhaps it wasn't the best time. But Helen was firm. She said she needed to see the child. It was part of the protocol. Mariah was in her room, lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. When Helen entered, the girl turned her face, startled. Helen introduced herself in a soft voice, said she was there to help, that she wouldn't hurt her. Mariah didn't answer. She just looked at the social worker with those large, sad eyes full of fear. Helen sat on the edge of the bed and tried to start a conversation. She asked how Mariah was feeling, if she was in pain, if she needed anything. The girl responded in monosyllables, always looking at the door where Mrs. Eleanor stood, observing everything. Helen realized that Mariah wouldn't say anything as long as her grandmother was present. She asked firmly for Mrs. Eleanor to leave the room. The woman hesitated, but eventually obeyed. When they were alone, Helen tried again. She said that Mariah could trust her, that everything she said would be kept confidential, that she was there to protect her. Mariah began to cry, but still didn't speak. Helen realized that the girl was too terrified to talk. She decided she would try another approach. She asked to see Mariah's scalp. The girl recoiled, startled, but Helen was gentle. She said she needed to see, that it was important. Mariah, with tears streaming down her face, allowed Helen to remove the pink scarf. What the social worker saw left her speechless. The wounds were there, some healing, others still open. There were marks of clips, perforations, infections. It was impossible to deny. That child had been tortured, and it hadn't been by the nanny who was in prison. The dates didn't match. The wounds were too recent. Helen took photos, made detailed notes, asked Mariah when it had happened. The girl, between sobs, said she couldn't speak, that if she spoke, it would be worse. Helen felt a deep anger. She knew exactly what was happening. That child was being threatened, manipulated, tortured, and the person responsible was there on the other side of the door, pretending to be the concerned grandmother. When she left the room, Helen glared at Mrs. Eleanor with a hard look. She said she would make a full report and that the case would be thoroughly investigated. Mrs. Eleanor maintained her composure, but Helen noticed a flicker of nervousness in her eyes. She knew she had struck a nerve. She left the mansion certain that this family hid secrets far darker than anyone could imagine. That same day, Helen sought out Camilla and showed her the photos she had taken. Camilla felt a mixture of relief and urgency. Finally, they had concrete evidence. But they needed to act fast. Mariah was in danger. Helen said she would file an urgent report requesting Mariah's immediate removal from Mrs. Eleanor's custody. Camilla agreed and said she would use that report to request a review of Victoria's case. Finally, things were starting to move in the right direction. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Fiona continued to observe Mrs. Eleanor. One afternoon, when the grandmother was alone with Mariah, Fiona left a hidden recorder in the room. She knew she was risking everything, but she didn't care. She needed evidence, and she got it. That night, when she listened to the recording, she was shocked. Mrs. Eleanor had threatened Mariah again. She had said that if the girl told the social worker anything, things would get terrible, that she would lose her father, be sent to an orphanage, be alone forever. Mariah, in tears, had begged her grandmother to stop, but Mrs. Eleanor only laughed, a cold, cruel laugh that sent a shiver down Fiona's spine. Fiona took the recording to Camilla. When the lawyer heard it, she felt deep indignation. That was the definitive proof. Mrs. Eleanor was the aggressor, and now they had a way to prove it. Camilla decided she would go to the police, that she would formally report Mrs. Eleanor, that she would do everything in her power to get Mariah out of that house and to clear Victoria's name. But before she could do anything, something unexpected happened. A video began circulating on social media. It was an amateur recording made by a cell phone showing Mariah at a medical appointment. The child's weak voice said that the imprisoned woman was innocent. that the one who hurt her was someone everyone admired. The video was shared thousands of times in a few hours. The news spread. The story turned upside down. Suddenly, everyone was questioning the official version. Everyone was asking who had really hurt Mariah. Victoria saw the video while working at the snack bar. She felt tears stream down her face. Finally, the truth was coming out. Finally, someone was believing her. But she also felt fear. She knew Mrs. Eleanor wouldn't accept this passively. She knew the woman would do everything to cover up the truth. And she was afraid of what she could do to Mariah. Robert also saw the video. He was in a meeting when his phone started vibrating non-stop. Messages from friends, colleagues, journalists, all asking about the video. When he finally managed to watch it, he felt the ground collapse beneath his feet. That was his daughter's voice. Those were his daughter's words. And she was saying that the nanny was innocent, that the one who hurt her was someone everyone admired. Robert felt a deep confusion. He couldn't process what he was hearing. He called his mother, desperate. Mrs. Eleanor answered in a calm voice, but he noticed a nervousness he had never heard before. She said the video was a hoax, that someone had manipulated Mariah, that everything was under control. But Robert was no longer sure. For the first time, he began to question his mother's version. The video's repercussions were immediate. The press resumed coverage of the case. Journalists surrounded the Castleford mansion. Camilla was interviewed and presented the evidence she had gathered. She showed the photos of the wounds, Helen's report, Fiona's recording. Public opinion began to shift. Suddenly, Victoria was no longer the villain. She was the victim. And Mrs. Eleanor, the respected grandmother, began to be seen as the true aggressor. The police were forced to reopen the case. A new detective was assigned, a man named Dr. Mark Smith, known for his seriousness and impartiality. He summoned Mrs. Eleanor for questioning. The woman arrived at the police station, accompanied by an expensive lawyer, elegantly dressed, maintaining her composure. But Dr. Smith was not impressed. He asked direct questions, confronted the inconsistencies in her version, presented the evidence Camilla had gathered. Mrs. Eleanor tried to remain calm, but began to stammer, to contradict herself. For the first time, her mask of control began to crack. Meanwhile, Mariah was taken to a temporary shelter, under the protection of Child Protective Services. Helen was responsible for accompanying the girl. For the first time in months, Mariah was away from Mrs. Eleanor. For the first time, she was safe, but she was also scared. She didn't know what was going to happen. She didn't know if she could trust anyone. Helen spent hours talking with her, trying to gain her trust, and little by little, Mariah began to open up. One night, while Helen was by her side, Mariah finally spoke. She said that her grandmother had been hurting her for months, that it started right after her mother's passing, that Mrs. Eleanor said she was to blame, that she was a bad child, that she deserved to be punished, that the clips were a punishment for every time she cried, complained, disobeyed. Mariah told everything, between tears and sobs, and Helen recorded every word. Finally, they had the victim's testimony. Finally, they had the truth. Mariah's testimony was presented to the judge. He was shocked by what he heard. He ordered Mrs. Eleanor's preventive arrest and the opening of a criminal case for child abuse, torture, and psychological abuse. He also ordered an immediate review of Victoria's case. The evidence was clear. Victoria was innocent. She had been the victim of a cruel and calculated setup. When Victoria received the news, she couldn't believe it. She was working at the snack bar when Camilla appeared, with a huge smile on her face. She said the case had been dismissed, that all accusations against her had been dropped, that she was free. Victoria broke down in tears. She hugged Camilla tightly, thanking her repeatedly. Finally, her life could begin again. Finally, her name was cleared, but the battle was not over. Mrs. Eleanor, even in prison, continued to deny everything. She said she was innocent, that she was a victim of a conspiracy, that Mariah had been manipulated. Her lawyer tried everything to get her out of prison, but the evidence was irrefutable. The photos, the testimonies, the recording, everything pointed to her. And with each passing day, more sordid details came to light. Robert was in shock. He couldn't believe that his mother, the woman he admired and respected, was capable of such cruelty. He spent days locked in his house, not speaking to anyone, trying to process everything that had happened. He felt guilty for not having noticed, for having been so blind, for having believed every lie his mother told. And he felt guilty above all for having failed his daughter, for not having protected Mariah when she needed him most. One day, Robert asked to visit Mariah at the shelter. Helen hesitated but eventually allowed it. When father and daughter met, there was a heavy silence. Mariah looked at her father with fear, but also with timid hope. Robert knelt in front of her, with tears in his eyes, and asked for forgiveness. He said he had failed as a father, that he hadn't noticed her suffering, that he should have protected her. Mariah, in tears, hugged her father, and at that moment something began to heal. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be fast, but it was a start. Victoria also asked to see Mariah. When they met, the girl ran into her former nanny's arms and cried. She said she knew Victoria was innocent, that she wanted her to come back, that she missed her. Victoria hugged Mariah tightly, promising that she would never abandon her again, that she would always be there whenever she needed her. And for the first time, in months, Mariah smiled, a small, timid but genuine smile. Meanwhile, Mrs. Eleanor's trial was being prepared. The prosecutor was gathering all the evidence, preparing a solid case. He knew that this trial would attract national attention. He knew he needed to ensure that justice was served, and he was determined to make it happen. But Mrs. Eleanor was not willing to accept defeat. Even in prison, she continued trying to manipulate the situation. She sent letters to Robert, trying to convince him that she was innocent. She tried to bribe witnesses. She tried to intimidate Mariah through intermediaries. But nothing worked. The truth was stronger than any manipulation, and with each passing day, more people realized who she really was. The press continued to cover the case intensely. Victoria was interviewed several times, telling her version of the story. She spoke about the suffering she endured, about the injustice she suffered, about the strength she found to keep fighting. Her story touched millions of people. Suddenly, she was no longer the accused nanny. She was the heroine who had risked everything to save a child, and the whole country was rooting for her. Mariah, little by little, was recovering. She still had nightmares, she was still afraid, but she was starting to trust again. She was undergoing therapy, she was starting to smile again, she was starting to be a child again. Helen continued to monitor her closely, ensuring she was safe and protected. And Robert, for the first time, was truly present in his daughter's life. He was learning to be a father, to listen, to protect. Victoria, for her part, was rebuilding her life. She got a better job at a private school working with children. She discovered that she had a talent for it, that she could connect with children in a special way, and that she could use her experience to help other children who were going through difficult situations. Camilla continued to be her friend and lawyer. The two had formed a strong bond during that difficult period, and Camilla was proud of what they had achieved together. She said that Victoria was one of the bravest people she had ever met, and that she was sure she would make a big difference in the lives of many children. 6 months had passed since Mrs. Eleanor's trial. Birmingham continued its bustling routine with its busy streets, crowded pubs, and vibrant life. But for Victoria, Mariah, and Robert, everything had changed. The life they knew before no longer existed, and in a way, that was good, because the life they had before was based on lies, on silences, on hidden pains. Now they were building something new, something true. Victoria woke up every morning in her apartment in the Shoreditch district. It was a small but cozy place. It had a balcony overlooking the mountains, where she liked to drink coffee while watching the sunrise. She worked at a private school where she was loved by the children and respected by her colleagues. Her story had become known, and many parents sought out the school precisely because they knew there was someone there who truly cared about the well-being of children. But her work at the school was not the only thing that filled Victoria's life. She had become a children's rights activist. She gave lectures, participated in events, helped other abuse victims find justice. Her story inspired many people. It showed that it was possible to fight against injustice even when everything seemed lost, and that the truth, no matter how difficult, was always worth it. Mariah was living with Robert in the new apartment. It was a completely different place from the mansion, simpler, cozier, more full of life. Mariah's room was decorated with cheerful colors, with drawings she had made herself, with photos of happy moments. There were no more scarves covering her head. Her hair was growing back, covering the scars that were once open wounds. She still had therapy twice a week, still had occasional nightmares, but she was much better. She was smiling again, she was playing again, she was being a child again. Robert had changed completely. He was no longer the absent businessman, always too busy to pay attention to his daughter. He had reduced his workload, delegated responsibilities, prioritized what really mattered. Now, he took Mariah to school every morning. They had lunch together whenever possible. He helped her with her homework, played with her, listened to her stories. He was learning to be a father, and, for the first time, he was truly present. One Saturday afternoon, Victoria went to visit Mariah and Robert. It had become a tradition. Every Saturday she spent the day with them. Sometimes they went to Hyde Park, sometimes to the cinema. Sometimes they just stayed home, talking, laughing, enjoying each other's company. That day they decided to go to Hyde Park in downtown Birmingham. It was a place Mariah loved. It had huge trees, lakes with ducks, plenty of space to run and play. While Mariah played on the playground, Victoria and Robert sat on a bench watching. Robert looked at Victoria and said he was grateful for everything she had done, that without her, Mariah probably wouldn't be there, happy and healthy. Victoria smiled and said she hadn't done anything special, that she had only done what anyone should do, protect a child who was suffering. Robert shook his head. He said that wasn't true, that many people had seen Mariah suffering and done nothing, that Victoria had risked everything, had lost everything, to save a child she barely knew, and that was something extraordinary. Victoria felt tears burn her eyes. She said she regretted nothing, that she would do it all again if necessary. Robert was silent for a few moments. Then he said there was something he needed to tell Victoria, something he had recently discovered that changed everything. Victoria looked at him, curious. Robert took a deep breath and began to speak. He said that after the trial he had started investigating his mother's past. He wanted to understand how she had become that cruel and manipulative person, and what he discovered shocked him. Mrs. Eleanor was not who he thought she was. She had a dark past, full of secrets she had hidden for decades. Robert recounted that Mrs. Eleanor had been married before meeting his father. She had a son from that first marriage, a boy named Luke, but the boy had disappeared when he was only 6 years old. The official version was that he had gotten lost in a park and was never found. But Robert had discovered documents that suggested something very different. There were reports from neighbors who said they had heard screams coming from Mrs. Eleanor's house. There were medical records showing that Luke had been hospitalized several times with unexplained injuries. And there was a report from a social worker who had visited the house and recommended the child's removal. But the report was never followed up, and Luke disappeared shortly after. Victoria was in shock. She asked if Robert thought Mrs. Eleanor had something to do with her son's disappearance. Robert said he wasn't sure, but the evidence suggested she did, that she had probably hurt the boy so severely that he didn't survive, and that she had covered everything up, pretending he had gotten lost. Victoria felt a chill. She asked if Robert had taken this information to the police. He said yes, that he had handed over all the documents he found, and that the police had reopened Luke's disappearance case. They were investigating, looking for answers. But so many years had passed that it was difficult to find concrete evidence. Victoria remained silent, processing everything she had heard. She realized that Mrs. Eleanor was even more dangerous than she imagined, that Mariah had not been her first victim, and that, if she hadn't been stopped, she probably wouldn't be the last. Robert said he felt guilty for not having noticed sooner, that there had been signs, there had been indications, but he was blind, that he trusted his mother absolutely, and that this trust almost cost his daughter's life. Victoria held Robert's hand and said that he couldn't blame himself forever, that the important thing was that now he was present, that he was protecting Mariah, that he was doing the right thing. Robert nodded, but still seemed burdened by guilt. He said he had decided to do something to honor Luke's memory, and to help other children who were going through similar situations. He was creating a foundation dedicated to the protection of child abuse victims. The foundation would offer legal, psychological, and financial support to families in need, and it would work to raise public awareness about the importance of reporting child abuse cases. Victoria was moved. She said she thought the idea was wonderful, and she offered to help. Robert accepted with gratitude. He said he needed people like Victoria, who understood the pain of victims, who knew what it was like to fight against injustice. Together, they could make a difference. As they talked, Mariah ran up to them, her face flushed from playing. She said she was hungry. Robert smiled and said they would get a snack. They went to a snack bar near the park. While they ate, Mariah talked about school, about the friends she had made, about the things she was learning. She was happy, and that was all Victoria and Robert wanted. After the snack, they returned to the apartment. Mariah asked Victoria to help her with a drawing she was making. It was a drawing of the family. It had her father, and Victoria, all smiling, holding hands. Victoria felt tears burn her eyes. She asked Mariah why she was in the drawing. The girl looked at her with those big eyes and said that Victoria was part of the family, that she always would be. Victoria hugged Mariah tightly. She said that she also considered Mariah and Robert family, that they were the most important people in her life, and that she would always be there for them, no matter what happened. That night, when Victoria returned home, she felt a deep peace. She knew there was still much to be done, that the fight for children's rights was long and difficult, but she also knew that she was not alone, that she had allies, that she had purpose, that she had love, and that was more than enough. Meanwhile, in a cold and lonely cell, Mrs. Eleanor lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't sleep. She thought of everything she had lost: respect, freedom, family. But she felt no remorse, no guilt, only anger. Anger at Victoria, who had destroyed her life. Anger at Mariah, who had spoken. Anger at Robert, who had abandoned her. And anger at herself for having been caught. But Mrs. Eleanor was not the type of person to give up easily. Even in prison, she continued planning, continued thinking of ways to regain control. She knew she had 12 years ahead of her, 12 years to plan her revenge, and she was determined to make it happen. But what Mrs. Eleanor didn't know was that the world outside had changed, that people were more attentive, more aware, that cases like Mariah's were being taken seriously, and that when she finally got out of prison, she would no longer have the power she once had. She would be just an old woman, marked by her crimes, rejected by society. Victoria, Mariah, and Robert continued their lives, building a better future. The foundation created by Robert began to operate, helping dozens of children and families. Victoria became one of the main spokespeople for the cause, giving lectures, participating in events, inspiring others to fight for children's rights. Mariah grew up strong and healthy. The scars on her head faded with time, as did the emotional scars. She never forgot what she went through, but she learned to live with it. She learned that it was possible to overcome pain, that it was possible to be happy again. And she learned that there were people who truly cared about her, who were willing to fight for her, who would never abandon her. And so, the story that began with pain, injustice, and suffering continued with healing, hope, and love. Victoria had proven that the truth always wins. Mariah had proven that it was possible to overcome even the deepest traumas. And Robert had proven that it's never too late to change, to be better, to make a difference. The Castleford mansion no longer existed. It had been demolished to make way for a new development. But the memories of that place, the pains and sufferings that occurred there, would never be forgotten. They would serve as a reminder that, behind perfect facades, the darkest secrets can hide. And that it is everyone's duty to be vigilant, to report, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Victoria, Mariah, and Robert knew this, and they were determined to make a difference, to ensure that no other child went through what Mariah went through, to ensure that justice was served, and to ensure that the truth always prevailed, no matter how difficult the path. And as the sun set over Birmingham, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Victoria looked out her apartment window and smiled. She knew there was still much to be done. But she also knew she was on the right path, and that, with love, courage, and determination, anything was possible. 2 years had passed since Mrs. Eleanor's trial. Birmingham continued its vibrant life, but for those who had been touched by Mariah's story, everything had changed irreversibly. The foundation created by Robert, named the Clare Castleford Institute in honor of his late wife, was fully operational. It occupied a building in the Fitzrovia district, with rooms for psychological, legal, and social assistance. It had already helped over 200 families, saved dozens of children from abuse situations, and had become a national reference in child protection. Victoria was now the pedagogical coordinator of the institute. She had left her job at the school to dedicate herself entirely to the cause. She worked directly with child abuse victims, helping them to recover, to trust again, to dream of a better future. Her personal story made her especially effective. Children identified with her, felt that she truly understood what they were going through, and Victoria dedicated herself body and soul to each case, as if each child were Mariah. Mariah, now 10 years old, was completely transformed. She was a cheerful, communicative, full of life girl. Her hair had grown back completely, covering the scars that were once open wounds. She was a good student, had many friends, practiced ballet, and loved to draw. She still had therapy, but now only once a week. The sessions were more about maintenance than intensive treatment. She had overcome the trauma in an impressive way, and this was due in large part to the love and support she received from Robert and Victoria. Robert had become an exemplary father. He participated in all of Mariah's activities, was present at every ballet recital, every school meeting, every important moment. He had found a balance between work and personal life. And for the first time in years, he was happy. Not just satisfied or comfortable, but genuinely happy. One Saturday morning, Victoria, Robert, and Mariah were at the Institute, preparing a special event. It was the Foundation's 2nd anniversary, and they were going to have a big celebration, with lectures, presentations, and tributes to the children who had been helped. Mariah was excited. She had prepared a special drawing to be displayed at the event. It was a large, colorful drawing, showing several children holding hands, smiling. In the center it was written, "Together we are stronger." While they were setting up the hall, Camilla arrived. She continued to be the Institute's lawyer, working voluntarily on complex cases. She had become a great friend of Victoria and Robert. She brought with her important news. She said that the police had finally concluded the investigation into the disappearance of Luke, the son Mrs. Eleanor had from her first marriage. Robert and Victoria stopped what they were doing and looked at Camilla attentive. She said that human remains had been found buried in the backyard of the old house where Mrs. Eleanor lived at the time. Tests confirmed they were Luke's, and the cause of death had been severe blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with assault. Mrs. Eleanor would be charged with homicide. Her sentence would be significantly increased. Robert felt his legs weaken. He sat in a chair, his face pale. He knew his mother was capable of terrible things, but hearing the confirmation that she had taken her own son's life was devastating. Victoria held his hand, trying to comfort him. Camilla said she understood it was difficult, but that it was important for the truth to come out, that Luke deserved justice, just like Mariah. Robert nodded, tears in his eyes. He said he would do everything in his power to honor Luke's memory, that he would ensure his story was told, that people knew what had happened, and that he would work even harder to ensure no other child suffered the same fate. Mariah, who was on the other side of the hall, noticed that something was wrong. She ran to her father and asked if everything was all right. Robert hugged his daughter tightly and said yes, everything was all right, that he had just received some sad news, but that he would be fine. Mariah hugged her father back, with that pure and unconditional love that only children are capable of giving. The event was a success. Hundreds of people attended, including politicians, journalists, activists, and especially families who had been helped by the Institute. There were lectures on the importance of reporting abuse cases, on how to identify signs of mistreatment, on how to help child victims of violence, and there were emotional testimonies from children and families who had been saved. Victoria was one of the speakers. She told her story from the day she arrived at the Castleford mansion to the moment she was exonerated. She spoke about the pain of being unjustly accused, about the despair of seeing Mariah suffering without being able to do anything, about the strength she found to keep fighting, and she spoke about the importance of never giving up on the truth, no matter how difficult the path. When she finished, she received a standing ovation. Many people were crying. Her story deeply touched everyone who heard it, and it inspired many to act, to report, to protect. Mariah also participated in the event. She went on stage and showed her drawing. She explained that each child in the drawing represented a child who had been saved, and that together they were stronger, that they could overcome anything. Her speech was short but powerful, and when she finished, she also received a standing ovation. Robert watched everything with a heart full of pride. Pride in his daughter, who had overcome so much and become such a strong and courageous girl. Pride in Victoria, who had risked everything to save a child she barely knew. And pride in himself for having found the strength to change, to be better, to make a difference. After the event, Victoria, Robert and Mariah went to dinner at a restaurant in the Lord's district. It was a cozy place, with home-cooked food and a family atmosphere. While they ate, they talked about the event, about the lectures, about the people they had met. Mariah was excited, talking about the compliments she had received for her drawing. Robert and Victoria listened attentively, smiling. At one point, Mariah looked at Victoria and asked if she was happy. Victoria was surprised by the question. She thought for a moment and then said yes, she was very happy, that she had a job she loved, people she loved, a purpose that gave meaning to her life, and that she wouldn't trade any of it for anything in the world. Mariah smiled and said she was also happy, that she had the best father in the world, the best friend in the world, and that she felt safe and loved. Robert felt tears burn his eyes. He said he was also happy, that he had the best daughter in the world and the best friend in the world, and that, despite everything they had been through, he was grateful, because all of it had made them stronger, more united, more human. Victoria raised her glass of juice and proposed a toast. She said she toasted to family, to friendship, to overcoming adversity. Robert and Mariah raised their glasses and toasted together. And at that moment, under the soft light of the restaurant, with the sound of conversations around them, the three felt a deep peace. They knew there were still challenges ahead, that the fight for children's rights was long and difficult, but they also knew that together they could face anything. Meanwhile, in a cold and lonely cell, Mrs. Eleanor had received the news that she would be charged with homicide. For the first time she felt fear, not fear of prison, for she was already imprisoned, but fear that her true nature would be completely exposed, that everyone would know who she really was, that her legacy would be one of monstrosity, not of respect. She tried to write a letter to Robert, asking for forgiveness, trying to explain, but she tore up the letter before finishing. She knew there was no explanation. She knew there was no forgiveness. She had done terrible, unforgivable things. And now, she was paying the price. But even so, she felt no remorse, no guilt, only anger. Anger at having been caught, anger at having lost control, anger at being there alone, forgotten, and that anger consumed her day after day, night after night. But the world outside had moved on. Mrs. Eleanor was no longer relevant. She was just a criminal, serving her sentence. And when she finally got out of prison, if she ever did, she would be just an old woman marked by her crimes, rejected by society. Victoria, Mariah, and Robert continued their lives, building an increasingly better future. The Clare Castleford Institute continued to grow, helping more and more children and families. Victoria continued giving lectures, inspiring people, making a difference. Mariah continued growing strong and healthy, full of dreams and hopes, and Robert continued to be the present and loving father he always should have been. And so, the story that began with pain, injustice, and suffering ended with healing, hope, and love. Victoria had proven that the truth always wins. Mariah had proven that it was possible to overcome even the deepest traumas, and Robert had proven that it's never too late to change, to be better, to make a difference. The Castleford mansion no longer existed. It had been demolished, and in its place was a public park, with trees, benches, playgrounds. a place of life, of joy, of hope, a place that symbolized transformation, overcoming, the victory of good over evil. And as the sun set over Birmingham, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Victoria, Robert and Mariah walked through the park hand in hand, smiling. They knew there was still much to be done, but they also knew they were on the right path, and that, with love, courage and determination, anything was possible. 5 years had passed since that day in the park, when Victoria, Robert and Mariah walked together under the starry Birmingham sky. Much had changed. Mariah was now 15 and in her first year of high school. She was a beautiful, intelligent teenager, full of dreams. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, completely covering the scars that once marked her childhood. She was popular at school, had many friends, and was known for her kindness and empathy. Few knew the story she carried, and she preferred it that way. She didn't want to be seen as the girl who was tortured by her grandmother. She wanted to be seen simply as Mariah. Victoria, now 34, continued to be the pedagogical coordinator of the Clare Castleford Institute. But her life had gained new dimensions. She had written a book telling her story, which became a national bestseller. The book, titled The Truth That Frees, had sold over 200,000 copies and was being translated into other languages. Victoria had become a public figure, recognized on the streets, invited to television shows, international lectures. But despite all the fame, she remained the same humble and dedicated person she always was. Her focus continued to be helping child abuse victims. Robert, now 42, had become one of the leading tech entrepreneurs in the Midlands. But his greatest pride was not his company, it was the Clare Castleford Institute. The foundation had grown exponentially. It now had branches in 3 British counties and had helped over 1,500 families. Robert dedicated a large part of his time and resources to the Institute, and he continued to be a present and loving father to Mariah. One Monday morning, Victoria was in her office at the Institute when she received an unexpected call. It was from a journalist named Beatrice Olsen who worked for a major London newspaper. Beatrice said she was investigating a story and needed to speak with Victoria urgently. She said she had information about Mrs. Eleanor that could change everything. Victoria felt a chill. It had been years since she had heard about Mrs. Eleanor. She knew she was still in prison, serving her sentence. But she had tried not to think much about her. She had moved on, built a new life. But curiosity was stronger. She agreed to meet Beatrice that same afternoon. They met at a coffee shop in the Soho district. Beatrice was a woman in her 30s with short hair and a determined look. She had a folder full of documents. When they sat down, she got straight to the point. She said she had discovered that Mrs. Eleanor was no longer in prison. She had been released 3 months ago for good behavior and health reasons. She was living in a small town in the Midlands under a false name. Victoria felt her blood run cold. She asked how this was possible. Mrs. Eleanor had been sentenced to over 20 years in prison. How could she have been released in just 7 years? Beatrice explained that there had been a series of appeals, that Mrs. Eleanor's lawyers had managed to reduce the sentence, that she had behaved exemplarily in prison, that there were health problems that justified parole. Victoria felt a mixture of anger and fear. She asked if Robert and Mariah knew. Beatrice said no, that she had discovered it while investigating another story, and thought Victoria should be the first to know. Victoria thanked her, but was in shock. She needed to tell Robert. She needed to protect Mariah. That same night, Victoria went to Robert's apartment. He immediately noticed that something was wrong. Victoria told him everything she had discovered. Robert turned pale. He sat on the sofa, his head in his hands. He said he couldn't believe it, that he thought that nightmare was over, that he thought Mariah was finally safe. Victoria said they needed to tell Mariah, that she had the right to know. Robert hesitated. He didn't want to scare her, didn't want to bring back painful memories, but Victoria insisted. She said it was better for Mariah to know from them than to find out from another source. Robert agreed reluctantly. When Mariah arrived home from school, she found her father and Victoria in the living room with serious expressions. She asked what was happening. Robert asked her to sit down. In a calm but firm voice, he told her about Mrs. Eleanor's release. Mariah was silent for a few moments. Then she asked if her grandmother knew where they lived. Robert said he wasn't sure, but that he would take all necessary precautions. Mariah nodded. She seemed calm, but Victoria noticed that her hands were trembling. She sat next to the girl and held her hand. She said she wouldn't let anything happen to her, that she would protect her no matter what it took. Mariah looked at Victoria with those big eyes and said she wasn't afraid, that Mrs. Eleanor no longer had power over her, that she was stronger now. Victoria felt her heart clench. Mariah was truly strong, but Victoria knew Mrs. Eleanor was dangerous, and that she wouldn't rest until she was sure Mariah was safe. In the following days, Robert hired security guards to protect Mariah. He installed security cameras in the apartment, at the institute, at the school. He contacted the police asking them to monitor Mrs. Eleanor, but he was informed that legally there was nothing they could do. Mrs. Eleanor had served her sentence, was on parole, and had not committed any crime since her release from prison. They couldn't arrest her preventively. Victoria also took her precautions. She started varying her routes, always being aware of her surroundings. She asked the institute staff to keep an eye out for any suspicious person, and she continued investigating, trying to find out where exactly Mrs. Eleanor was and what she was doing. Beatrice, the journalist, continued to help. She had become interested in the story and was determined to uncover the truth. She managed to track Mrs. Eleanor to a small town called St. Albans on the river, about 100 kilometers from Birmingham. She was living under the name Nusa Silva in a simple house, seemingly alone. Victoria decided she needed to go there. She needed to see with her own eyes what Mrs. Eleanor was doing. Robert wanted to go along, but Victoria said it was better for him to stay with Mariah, that she would go with Beatrice, that they would only observe, that they wouldn't approach. Robert agreed, but made Victoria promise to be careful. The next day, Victoria and Beatrice drove to St. Albans on the river. It was a small, quiet town surrounded by mountains. They easily found Mrs. Eleanor's house. It was a simple house with a low gate, a neglected garden. They parked across the street and watched. After a few hours, Mrs. Eleanor came out. Victoria felt a shock when she saw her. The woman had aged a lot. She was thinner, more stooped, with completely white hair. But her eyes remained the same, cold, calculating. She walked to a small nearby grocery store, bought a few things, and returned home. Victoria and Beatrice continued observing for a few more hours, but nothing abnormal happened. Mrs. Eleanor seemed to be living a simple, solitary life, but Victoria was not convinced. She knew that woman. She knew she was capable of hiding her true intentions very well. When they returned to Birmingham, Victoria told Robert everything. He was relieved to learn that Mrs. Eleanor seemed to be living a quiet life, but Victoria remained suspicious. She said they would continue monitoring, that they wouldn't let their guard down. In the following weeks, life returned to apparent normality. Mariah continued going to school, Robert continued working, Victoria continued at the institute. But everyone was more attentive, more cautious. And Victoria remained in contact with Beatrice, who continued investigating Mrs. Eleanor. One afternoon, Beatrice called Victoria with a disturbing discovery. She had found out that Mrs. Eleanor was frequenting a primary school in St. Albans on the river, not as an employee but as a volunteer. She was helping in the library, reading stories to the children. Victoria felt a chill. Mrs. Eleanor near children was a danger. They needed to do something. Victoria contacted the school principal, identified herself, and told her about Mrs. Eleanor's past. The principal was shocked. She said she knew nothing, that Mrs. Eleanor had presented herself as a retired lady who wanted to help. She thanked Victoria for the information and said she would dismiss Mrs. Eleanor immediately. But when she tried to do so, Mrs. Eleanor disappeared. She simply vanished. She left the house in St. Albans on the river, didn't notify anyone, left no trace. Victoria felt a deep fear. Mrs. Eleanor was a fugitive, and no one knew where she was. Robert redoubled security. Mariah was accompanied by security guards 24 hours a day. Victoria also hired personal security, and the police were called. But without knowing where Mrs. Eleanor was, there wasn't much they could do. Weeks passed in tension. Everyone was afraid, waiting for something to happen. But nothing happened. Mrs. Eleanor remained missing, and with each passing day, the fear grew. Until, one night, Mariah received a letter. It had no sender, just her name handwritten on the envelope. When she opened it, she found a short message, written in that handwriting she would recognize anywhere. It was from Mrs. Eleanor. The message read, "You think you're safe, but I'll always be watching. You'll never get rid of me." Mariah felt her blood run cold. She showed the letter to her father and Victoria. Robert was furious. He immediately called the police. Victoria tried to calm Mariah, but the girl was visibly shaken. For the first time in years, the fear had returned. The police analyzed the letter, but found no fingerprints or clues about where it had been posted. Mrs. Eleanor was careful. She knew how to leave no trace, and she was clearly trying to intimidate Mariah. Victoria decided she wouldn't let Mrs. Eleanor win, that she wouldn't allow that woman to destroy the peace Mariah had achieved. She began to investigate on her own, using all the contacts she had made over the years. And finally she got a lead. An old acquaintance of Mrs. Eleanor, a woman who had worked with her years ago, contacted Victoria. She said Mrs. Eleanor had called her, asking to borrow money. She said she was going through difficulties, that she needed help. The woman, suspicious, did not lend the money, but she wrote down the number from which Mrs. Eleanor had called. Victoria gave the number to the police. They managed to track the location. Mrs. Eleanor was in Birmingham. She was hiding in a cheap boarding house in the Limehouse district. The police went there immediately, and they found Mrs. Eleanor. She was arrested again, this time for violating the terms of her parole and for making threats. As she was being led away, she looked directly at the journalist's camera and said, "This isn't over. It will never be over." Victoria watched the arrest on television. She felt a deep relief, but also concern. Mrs. Eleanor was right about one thing. As long as she was alive, she would always be a threat. But Victoria was determined not to let that woman destroy their lives again. Mariah, upon learning of the arrest, felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She said she could finally breathe again. Robert hugged his daughter tightly, promising that he would never again allow Mrs. Eleanor to approach her. And Victoria, looking at Mariah and Robert, promised herself that she would do everything in her power to ensure that Mrs. Eleanor never left prison again, that she would fight, that she would use all her influence, all her contacts, to ensure that that woman paid for all her crimes, because the truth, no matter how difficult, was always worth it. Justice, no matter how long it took, always arrived, and love, no matter how tested, always won. And Victoria, Mariah, and Robert were living proof of that. They had overcome so much, they had fought so much, and they weren't going to give up now. No matter what happened, they would keep fighting. Together, always together.